Hi, this video is going to cover Unit 4, Problems Involving Fractions in the Math Plus Yellow program. This unit really talks about and incorporates story problems with fraction computation. It starts off with multiplication, which was also covered in Unit 3, so definitely go back to Unit 3 if your child is still struggling with multiplication of fractions. And then, as you can see, it moves on into addition and subtraction of fractions. In fifth grade, students begin to add fractions and subtract fractions that have unlike denominators, and they also work a lot more with mixed numbers. Now, when you get to this last lesson, this is skipped for your child, and it is because that is part of the math portfolio, and we will push that out later, and we may make modifications to that. So just keep that skipped. But what I'm going to do first of all is just head over to the student activity guide, and you will see that when you open up the table of contents and you go to the problems involving fractions, most of the activities in the student activity guide deal with multiplication of fractions, so it will review things as you go through. The one thing that I do want to reiterate is the importance of modeling. As you go through these lessons, there will be a lot of lists and procedures that you can use with your student to model or to go through and get the answer, but we want students to realize that computing with fractions isn't about just doing all these magical things and getting an answer. It's about really understanding what 1/2 of something is. So what we're going to do is go through one of the lesson checkpoints. There are going to be lots of interactive activities that incorporate what we're doing, but feel free to also pull out that piece of paper. And also, as you go into the student activity guide and you go to the resource section down at the bottom, there's going to be fraction circle printouts, fraction model printouts, some centimeter grid paper. So I highly recommend that you use those resources as well, so that the student understands what it means to multiply fractions. So let's take a peek at question number 1 in this this first checkpoint, and I'm going to use my document camera as we go through this, but it says that the gardeners planted bushes in the city park, and they planted 1/3 of the bushes as the rose bushes, and then they wanted 1/4 of, and we use that multiplication sign to show of, the rose bushes to be pink. How many of the bushes planted were pink rose bushes? Well, we could just simply have students follow the algorithm and multiply across. 1 times 1 is 1. 3 times 4 is 12. And so they get an answer, but they may not really understand what 1/4 of 1/3 looks like. If we use a model such as this and we divide our garden, here's our garden, here's our 1/3 of the garden is our rose bushes. But we want 1/4 of those 1/3 to be pink. So let's go this way to divide into fourths. And you can see that this section right here is where they overlap. That is 1/4 of my 1/3. If I count all the pieces, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and I have 1 of the 12. So you get the same answer either way. This area model lets students really visualize what 1/3 of 1/4 or 1/4 of 1/3 actually is. As we move on, there's going to be some work with mixed numbers. So here it says Max will use 3 bags of cement for his project. Each bag of cement needs 3 and 1/2 gallons of water. So if I use my document camera again, and I have 3, but I want it 3 and 1/2 times, or 3 1/2 3 times. Remember, with the commutative property you can go back and forth. So I'm going to do 3 1/2 3 times, because it doesn't matter the order here. So I have 3 1/2, and I have it 3 times. So let's see how many wholes and halves we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This half and this half could make 10, and I have 1/2 left over. So the answer would be 10 and 1/2. If I followed the standard algorithm, I would be encouraging students to change this from a mixed number to an improper fraction by multiplying and then adding. So I would have 3 times 6, 7 halves, which would end up with 21 halves. And again, this would show that exact same thing, that I have 21 halves. But This, to me, doesn't make as much sense as using this model down here, because now the students have one more procedure to follow. They need to simplify, and they need to divide 21 by 2. 21 can be divided by 2 10 times with 1 left over. So you get the same answer, but this way makes a whole lot more sense to kids because they can see the math. So as we move on, now we're going to get into mixed numbers times mixed numbers. This one is especially complicated, and I know that even me modeling it can be complicated as well. So definitely pull out those fraction circles. So if we have 2 1/4, and we have it 3.5 times, we could definitely encourage the students to make these mixed numbers improper fraction and multiply across. But let's see what happens if we use a model. So I have 2 1/4. And so remember, I'm only using this one little section of these pieces. And then I have my 2 wholes. But I want 2 1/4 3 times. So here's another time. Here's 3 times. But then I want it a half of a time as well. So here's my 3 wholes. And now I want it to be a half, because I need 2 1/4, 3 and 1/2 times. So let me draw that 2 1/4. But this time I only want to take half of it. Now if I'm going to take half of it, I'm going to divide these up a little differently into fourths, and I'm going to see how many fourths I have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Well, 9/4 can't be divided evenly by 2. So I'm going to divide it up even further and make it into 8ths. So let me get my marker here, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. I have 18 eighths. Well, I can divide 18 by 2. So let's take 8. Here's a whole. And then I'll take one of these. So basically, what I have done now is I have 8 9/8. So up here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Here's another whole, 7. And then I have 3/4, because I'm going to add all these together, and then I have this 1/8. Well, what we're going to soon realize is we can't add things that aren't the same denominator. So let's go ahead and divide these into eighths also, so that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 6/8, which is the same thing. It's equivalent. So when I have 7 plus 6/8 plus 7/8, I end up with 7 7/8. And that, as you can see, is what the answer is. It did take a lot of drawing and thinking and dividing up, but in the long run, it's going to make more sense than simply saying, okay, let's multiply here, and we'll have 9/8 times 7/2. We're going to end up with these large numbers. And this is supposed to be a fourth. So we have 8 9/4 times 7/2. We're going to end up with 63/8, and it's going to be really large, and then we have to simplify that. So definitely encourage your child to model the math as they go through the problems. Now let's head over, and we're going to go into addition and subtraction of fractions. Now, when we add and subtract fractions, here we have 1/4 plus 1/4. So they both have the same denominator. The mistake that many students make is they think that 1/4 plus 1/4 is 1/8. Well, that is not necessarily the case. 1/4 plus 1/4, if we just add across, or they may even say it would be 2/8 if they add across. Well, that's not, even if we had 2 of those, it's not going to total the same amount. So that would be wrong. 1/4 times 1/4 or plus 1/4 is actually 2/4. And if we simplified that, it would be 1/2. 1/2 and 2/4 are equivalent fractions, because I know that I could divide the numerator and denominator by 2 and simplify that to 1/2. So that's really important for students to realize, that you must have like denominators before you can add and subtract, but we don't add the denominators together. We keep that denominator the same. Now, as you go through the lessons, there are some things that get a little tricky, and I'm going to go through the lesson checkpoint with you, because even though they only use common denominators, in this, subtracting and using mixed numbers can be a different challenge that students may struggle with, just because even like we do with whole numbers, you may need to regroup a fraction as well. So this very first one is very simple. We add across, so we have 6/9. But we do need to simplify that and find that common factor, so we can simplify that to 2/3. As we go to the next problem, the challenge is that we are subtracting, and we have 5 and 1/9, and we take away 2 and 5/9. I always like to kind of turn it vertically so it's easier to think about and regroup. This is where I would also pull out those fraction circles and show them what 5 looks like and what 1/9 looks like. And if we only have 1/9, it would be hard to take 5/9 away from 1/9. So we need to think about a different way to regroup this 5. And I know that if I have 4, but I also have 9/9, that's the same thing as 1. So 4 plus 9/9 is the same thing as 5, because I have 4 plus 1 is 5. And I could still have my 1/9, but I could rewrite this as 4 and 10/9. So I took this 5 and turned it into a 9/9, or 1 whole, plus 1/9 to make 10/9. And now it is easier to subtract. Again, my denominators stay the same. I have 10 take away 5 is 5. So I have 10 of the pieces, take away 5 of the pieces is 5. And then my answer is 2 and 5/9. So definitely encourage your child to think about how to regroup when subtracting, and also just basically knowing when to add and subtract. So as we go through these other lessons, there will be tutorials on how they can find those common denominators when adding fractions. Right now, I'm going to head into Lesson C. I'm going to go straight to the checkpoint. In this Lesson B, they're going to practice adding unlike denominators and how to find them. And then in Lesson C and Lesson D is going to be continuation of that with mixed numbers as well. So what I'm going to do is pull out my document camera just to review a little bit with you. Here, and this is what you're going to also see in the OLS, you can see that there are fractions that are added and the denominators are not the same. And so we want to find that least common denominator, or that least common multiple, so that we can have the same denominator on both. So when we think of turning this 4 and 8 into the same denominator, we need to think about the multiples. So if I think about what I can multiply, multiples are when you make a number bigger by multiplying. We have 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 3 is 12, 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times 1 is, or 8 times 1 is 8, 8 times 2 is 16, 8 times 3 is 24. And we look, do we see anything that's in common? Do they have a common? That's what that C stands for. And I see an 8 here and an 8 here, and that's the least thing they have in common. They do have a 16 and 16 in common too, but that's not the least. So I can turn the 4 into an 8 by simply multiplying by 2. That 2 gives us a clue. So I have 3 times 2 would be 6. And then I know that my 8 is going to be on the bottom because I've multiplied 4 times 2 as well. And it says then you multiply the numerators by your answers. So even though that can be a little confusing, basically what we want to say is we've turned this 3/4 into an equivalent fraction. So we have 3 times 2 and 4 times 2 to get 6/8. Now we can take 2/8 away, because we're taking 2/8 away from 6/8 and we end up with 4/8. And this is something that we can simplify if we have our 4/8 down here, we can simplify that to be 1/2, because I know that 4 is half of 8, and I can simplify that to 1/2. The same thing applies when you're doing subtraction. You cannot subtract if you do not have common denominators. So first of all, think about what happens if I multiply by 1 times 2 times 3 times 4 times 5. 5 times 1 is 5, 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 3 is 15, 5 times 4 is 20, and I could keep going on and on. 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, and 3 times 5 is 15. Let's look to see if they have anything in common. I see a 15 here and a 15 here. This one doesn't have a 10 and this one doesn't have a 5, so 15 is the least common denominator. So I need to turn both of these into a 15. So I know that to get the 5 to a 15, I had to multiply by 3. So I'm going to multiply by 3 over 3. And I have 12 fifteenths. 12 fifteenths is the same as 4/5 because we simply multiplied by 1. Now I'm going to do the same thing with 2/3, but when I got the multiple of to make 15, I had to multiply by 5, so I'm going to multiply by 5 over 5, or the same thing as 1, to make it have the same denominator but be the same size. So now when I subtract 12 fifteenths minus 10 fifteenths, I get 2 fifteenths. So you can see the denominators are now the same. So there are tons of tutorials and videos in working that out. As you go through the lesson, you're going to have very similar problems just like that. When there's mixed numbers, before you subtract, you will need to make sure they have common denominators, just like we did with the other numbers. So this is a little more complicated. If we find the least common multiple, we can see that it's 12 because 6 times 2 is 12 and 4 times 3 is 12. So we multiply the numerator and denominator by both, and then we simply work that out and solve the problem. As we go through, you will also have subtraction. We cannot subtract if we don't have common denominators. So let's turn this 4 into an 8 and multiply times 2 times 2. This one is going to need some regrouping. So we're going to have to regroup that 3 and turn it into a 2 with the improper fraction so that we can take 1 5/8 away. So this part can be a little tricky. It does take practice. And then, as I said, you will go into the core focus and we will skip the unit extended problems. One resource that I want to highly recommend is the 5th grade math page. When you go to the 5th grade math page, there is a page devoted directly to fractions. If your student is struggling with basic fraction comprehension, click on the 4th grade page and go back and review some of those foundational skills, such as comparing fractions and understanding what a fraction means. As you scroll down, you will then get into more of the division and multiplication of fractions that were covered in the last unit. And then we get into adding and subtracting fractions and using fractions in real-world situations. Adding and subtraction a fraction seems to be a little more complicated than multiplying and dividing just because of the unlike and like denominators, but these are great video tutorials because it's talking about how you can't have apples and oranges and they need to be the same, so it's all about making them the same. And then there's a lot of fun interactive games to reinforce addition and subtraction as well. And there's even some fun enrichment activities that go into understanding fractions and decimals and percents. So enjoy working with your child with fractions. Enjoy using fractions in the real world. Have cooking activities. With the holidays coming up, there's tons of fun things that you can do, especially with doubling recipes or adding mixed fractions together. So take advantage of that. And I hope this has been helpful, and definitely attend the Class Connect sessions because there is going to be lots more modeling and resources available that will help your child be successful. Thank you.